Welcome to the 28storms.com tropical weather update for Monday, July 18th. Here is the latest official forecast package from the National Hurricane Center for Tropical Storm Bret as of 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Maximum sustained winds are now 50 miles per hour, and Bret is moving off toward the north-northeast at 6 miles per hour. We're not expecting much in the way of a change in acceleration over the next day or so, but it should begin to increase in forward speed as it begins to move off into the north-central Atlantic. We are now taking a look at the tropical model suite, and as you can see, the overwhelming number of models are in agreement with the official forecast that this will remain east of the United States and to the west and north of Bermuda. So this will be a storm that is moving safely out to sea, and only shipping interests will be impacted. As I will show you in just a moment, Bret is looking better on satellite imagery, and the official forecast still calls for the tropical storm to have a maximum intensity of 65 miles per hour before it begins to weaken, and that is supported by the overwhelming model consensus. As we can see, several model members do take this between 55 and even 60 knots before it begins to weaken. Afternoon visible imagery shows an increase in banding features, and the low-level center still appears to be located directly within the middle of the coldest cloud tops, as we can also see on the latest infrared imagery. And it looks like conditions still are favorable enough for slow and steady intensification. As of right now, none of the models are taking this to minimal Category 1 hurricane status, so Bret will still more than likely remain nothing more than a tropical storm, but we will continue to monitor things. Perhaps the greatest trouble for this storm, or at least potential trouble for this storm over the next 24 hours, could be this large mass of dry air located just to the north and west of the storm. Usually, dry air does not begin to intrude into the inner core of tropical cyclones unless wind shear values are generally greater than 15 knots. As we can see, the wind shear isn't all that strong just yet, but that could become a greater issue with time, so we'll just have to keep an eye on that as well. We're now looking at a more regional water vapor imagery. You can see much of the country along with the western Atlantic. We still have the mid-level ridge here over much of the central United States. And as talked about yesterday afternoon, the model guidance was beginning to show another long wave trough beginning to dive to the south out of the mid-Atlantic and New England states. And sure enough, we see that beginning to come in from southeast Canada, and it's now beginning to dip into the northwest Atlantic, and that's going to help to draw this tropical storm to the northeast and away from the United States. Here is another visual representation. Again, we have that mid-level ridge centered near Missouri, but that trough is really beginning to deepen here off the New England states. And here we go with the weakness, and it's going to ride right up into this weakness and eventually straight out to sea. Once again, current upper-level wind shear is not that strong. It's generally less than 5 knots, so this is a very favorable environment. And it should remain favorable for at least the next 24 hours until it begins to move more toward the northeast. And once it gets up into this region, it could begin to become impacted by a little bit more westerly wind shear. Switching gears to the rest of the Atlantic Basin, we're looking fairly quiet out there today. Much of the Gulf of Mexico is clear, although you will notice that the same stalled-out boundary that spawned Tropical Storm Bret also extends well into the north-central Gulf of Mexico. Fortunately, convection is very disorganized and very weak, and it's also located primarily over land, so we're not expecting anything in the Gulf anytime soon. There's also a very weak tropical disturbance passing just to the south of Puerto Rico this afternoon, but if we look on the latest water vapor imagery, we do see that there is an upper-level low located just to the north of Hispaniola right here, and that's causing a lot of unfavorable wind shear across much of the Caribbean, so we're not expecting anything in the Atlantic over the next 3 to 5 days. But if we switch gears back to the visible and infrared satellite imagery, look what's down south. We've been talking about this for the past week. We've had a low pressure come off of the coast of Nicaragua, and it's moved more toward the west out into the open waters of the eastern Pacific, and sure enough, we have a developing tropical storm, and its name is Dora. Dora is quickly organizing into a well-defined tropical storm. The latest visible imagery shows that the low-level circulation is still a bit exposed right here, but convection is beginning to wrap more around the center in all quadrants, and it will be a matter of time until Dora strengthens into a hurricane. And in fact, the official forecast will show that Dora is expected to become a major hurricane in the medium range. Also, if we take a look at the latest infrared, we see that the cold cloud tops are expanding and are becoming more abundant in nature. And also, if we look at the latest water vapor imagery, you can see that the pattern is fairly favorable. We have no restriction of the equatorward outflow channel here down toward the south. If anything, we do still have some northerly wind shear near the Mexican coast, but that is expected to decrease with time, and dry air is not expected to become a major inhibiting factor. This is the most recent track forecast from the National Hurricane Center. As you can see, by as early as Wednesday morning, Dora is expected to become a minimal hurricane, and if we look out into the medium range by Thursday and the early part of next weekend, we see that Dora is expected to be a major hurricane sitting just off the coast of the Mexican Riviera. Fortunately, Mexico is not in the cone of error at this time, but residents along the coast are still advised to keep up with the weather over the next week. As of right now, the model consensus is also in agreement with the official forecast track, so Dora should remain off the Mexican coast, but once again, keep an eye on things if you live around here. This is a quick view of some of the intensity model forecasts, and as you can see, every single model is in agreement that Dora will continue to steadily intensify through the period, but as the Hurricane Center is alluding to, many of the models are likely underdoing the development of the storm, especially considering the overwhelmingly favorable conditions and the already impressive structure of our tropical storm. The overall steering pattern across much of North America and the Eastern Pacific is not expected to change much at all over the next week, so I'm fairly confident that the official forecast track for Tropical Storm Dora will be fairly consistent and remain to the south of Mexico. If we look at the latest sim steering wind analysis, once again we have that powerful mid-level ridge over much of the central United States and extends well into the southwest toward Mexico, and that's going to keep this tropical storm from moving more toward the north. It's going to continue to move west and around the periphery of the high, and eventually once it gets down to around here, it's going to begin to quickly weaken under cooler water temperatures. By looking at water vapor imagery, you can tell just how stagnant the overall pattern is. We can clearly define the western periphery or extent of the mid-level ridge that extends well to the southwest near the Baja Peninsula, and we see that there is a long wave trough over the northeast Pacific, but it's really not deepening or progressing all that well. And once again, it's a fairly stagnant pattern, and it's expected to remain this way for at least the next 5 days. So we should not have any problems along the Mexican coast, with the exception of rip currents. But as always, keep up with the weather. Things are subject to change, but nevertheless, I am fairly confident. If we begin to look ahead, we'll start off with the 12Z Canadian forecast model. As we can see in the Eastern Pacific, it quickly develops Tropical Storm Dora into a more potent tropical cyclone, more than likely toward a hurricane or a major hurricane. In the meantime, the rest of the Eastern Pacific and Atlantic Basin is fairly quiet. We do see a weak impulse coming across the Central Atlantic here. We'll keep an eye on that, but as of right now, the model is not showing any development. And switching models very quickly, this is now the 12Z GFS. As you can see, Tropical Storm Bret is moving safely out to sea just to the north of Bermuda, and it's also keeping Tropical Storm Dora well to the south of Mexico and the Baja Peninsula. In the meantime, much of the Gulf, Caribbean, and Atlantic are quiet, but we still notice the same feature that the Canadian model is picking up on, but it's really not doing much with anything out there in the Central Atlantic at this time. Here is the position of Tropical Storm Dora on the latest 12Z ECMWF, and as I advance this, you will see that the model still intensifies the storm much like the others, and it also keeps it well to the south of the Mexican Riviera, so we're looking good out there in the Eastern Pacific so far. It also takes Tropical Storm Bret well out to sea, as advertised by all of the other model guidance. Much of the Gulf, Caribbean, and Western Atlantic still look all clear. Now, by 120 hours, it is picking up on the same feature that the Canadian and GFS are. It just takes it a little bit more toward the south here. It's a potential tropical wave in the northeast Caribbean, but it's not showing any signs of development in this forecast. And by day 7, it's now beginning to enter eastern Cuba. But once again, no signs of development in the models throughout the next 7 days. And finally, I do have some good news to report here in the western Pacific. We are still monitoring Typhoon Mayon, and it will be making a landfall across southern Japan. However, Mayon has significantly weakened and is not going to be making landfall as forecast as a major hurricane. In fact, it will more than likely be packing nothing more than upper end Category 1 sustained winds. As we can see, a lot of dry air has been able to intrude into the inner core of the storm, so that has gutted the system out fairly well. But still, this typhoon is nothing to sneeze at. It's going to be approaching southern Japan and then begin to parallel the coast at a fairly low or slow rate of speed, and therefore typhoon force conditions will be impacting much of the same areas for a good 12 to 24 plus hours. So fortunately, it looks like we've dodged the biggest bullet here in Japan, but we still have a typhoon on the way, and hopefully final preparations are coming to a conclusion and people are beginning to take shelter there. So that is your tropical weather update for this Monday afternoon. Altogether, we're looking pretty good out there in the tropics today. And please stick with 28storms.com throughout hurricane season 2011.